Hey everyone! Welcome back! Today, we're diving into a thrilling story that starts with a routine plumbing job but quickly turns into a discovery that changes everything. When Jamal steps into the Whittakers' grand home, he senses something unusual. What will he uncover in the basement that reveals a hidden past of love and tension? Let's find out. The day began like any other for Jamal. His phone buzzed as the morning sun barely peeked over the horizon, casting a soft glow through his apartment window. His eyes, still heavy from sleep, adjusted to the light as he grabbed the phone. The notification read, "New job request." Another job, another house in need of fixing. Jamal had been a plumber for over a decade. The pipes, leaks, and clogs that troubled most people were routine challenges to him, puzzles that needed solving. His hands knew the rhythms of the work, the feel of a wrench turning, the sound of water rushing through cleared pipes, the weight of responsibility in making sure everything worked seamlessly. The job was physically demanding, but it was also straightforward. Fix the problem, leave the client satisfied, and move on to the next call. However, as he glanced through the request, something about the address made him pause. It was located in Bellwood Heights, a neighborhood he had rarely been called to. The place had a reputation, well off, predominantly white, where even the slightest thing out of place was noticed. He had heard stories of people who didn't belong there getting odd looks, questioned about their business. But Jamal wasn't worried. He was there to do a job, nothing more. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this adventure, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe. We appreciate your support and can't wait to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's jump back in. He loaded his toolbox into the back of his van and set off. As the city streets gradually gave way to wide, tree-lined avenues, the homes began to change. Apartment blocks turned into spacious, manicured houses with perfectly trimmed hedges and immaculately maintained lawns. The cars parked in driveways were pristine, and even the air felt different, quieter, almost too quiet. When Jamal arrived at the Whittaker house, it was exactly what he expected, a large colonial-style mansion, the kind that screamed wealth from its imposing columns to its perfectly symmetrical windows. The lawn looked freshly mowed, not a blade of grass out of place. He pulled into the driveway, feeling the weight of the house's presence. Everything was designed to impress, to show the world that the people living here had everything under control. As he stepped out of the van, he took a deep breath, mentally preparing himself for the interaction ahead. Over the years, he had developed a sixth sense about his clients. He could always tell within minutes what kind of rapport they would have. Some were warm and appreciative of his work, others a bit more distant, treating him as an invisible service provider. He suspected the Whittakers would be the latter. He rang the doorbell, and after a few moments, the door opened to reveal Mrs. Whittaker. She was a slender woman in her early 40s, wearing a neatly pressed blouse and slacks. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her expression was polite but guarded, as though she was already measuring her words before speaking. "Good morning," she said, her voice formal. "You must be the plumber." "I'm Mrs. Whittaker." "Yes, ma'am." "I'm Jamal," he replied, nodding slightly. "I'm here about the leak in the basement." "Right. Please, come in." She stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The interior of the house was just as polished as the exterior, high ceilings, hardwood floors that gleamed under the morning light, and walls adorned with expensive-looking artwork. The air inside was cool, almost sterile, and Jamal immediately sensed the type of environment this was, everything in its place, no room for anything out of the ordinary. Mrs. Whittaker led him through the house, her heels clicking on the floor as they passed through the spacious living room and into the hallway. Every room looked like something out of a magazine, pristine, curated, as if no one truly lived there. It was a house that seemed to exist more for appearances than for comfort. As they approached the basement door, she hesitated for a moment. Jamal noticed the small pause, but she quickly recovered. "The leak is near the water heater," she said, her voice a bit softer now. "My husband is very particular about how things are handled around here, so if you could, just be careful. He doesn't like things being moved or disturbed unnecessarily." Jamal nodded. He had dealt with this before, the kind of homeowners who worried more about their belongings than the actual problem. He reassured her, "I'll be as careful as possible, ma'am. Just need to get the job done." She offered him a faint smile, though her eyes still carried that guarded look, and she opened the door to the basement. The cool air from below wafted up as Jamal descended the wooden stairs, the sounds of the house above fading away with each step. Down here, things were different. The perfect facade of the upper levels disappeared, replaced by the typical clutter of a storage space. Boxes were stacked against the walls, some labeled with dates and vague descriptions, like holiday decorations and old books. Jamal took in the scene, scanning the room for any immediate signs of water damage. The leak wasn't difficult to find, there was a slow, steady drip coming from the pipes near the water heater. It wasn't a major problem, but if left unchecked, it could cause significant damage. He set his toolbox down and began to assess the situation. As he worked, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions, his eyes drifted across the room. Something unusual caught his attention. Behind a stack of old boxes in the corner, barely visible through the dim light, was an old wooden chest. Unlike the rest of the basement's clutter, this chest looked out of place. It was worn, its wood scratched and faded, as if it had been through decades of wear and tear. Curiosity tugged at Jamal. He wasn't one to snoop, but something about the chest felt different, as though it had been deliberately hidden away. His mind briefly entertained the thought of leaving it alone, focusing solely on the leak, but the more he stared at it, the more he felt compelled to take a closer look. Setting down his wrench, Jamal approached the chest. It was heavier than it looked, its lid slightly ajar. With a gentle nudge, the lid creaked open, revealing its contents, a collection of old black and white photographs, yellowed with age, along with a stack of neatly folded letters tied together with a ribbon. At the top of the pile was a small, weathered book. Jamal's heart skipped a beat as he picked up the book. The leather cover was cracked and worn, but the initials EW were still faintly visible on the front. He flipped it open, his fingers tracing the delicate pages. The first few entries were personal notes, written in careful, looping script. But as he read further, the tone shifted. The notes became love letters, written between two people, EW, the writer, and a man named Samuel. The further he read, the clearer the picture became. Samuel was a black man, and based on the context, it seemed he had been a chauffeur or some sort of servant for the Whittaker family many years ago. But the letter spoke of something more than just a working relationship. There was affection, longing, and passion hidden within the words, a love that had been kept secret from the world. Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He had stumbled upon something deeply personal, something that had likely been buried for decades. Jamal stood frozen, the faded love letters trembling slightly in his hands. He couldn't believe what he was reading, letters filled with deep emotion, affection, and longing between two people whose lives were worlds apart. A servant and a woman from an affluent white family, their love hidden in the shadows of history. The implications of what he'd found slowly settled over him, thick and heavy. The chest, tucked away in the far corner of the basement, seemed to guard its secret vigilantly, as if waiting for someone to rediscover its contents. Jamal's initial instinct was to close it and pretend he'd never seen it. This wasn't his business. He was here to fix a leak, not unravel family secrets. Yet, there was something so powerful in the discovery that it gripped him. He wasn't just looking at old papers, he was holding a piece of history, a story that had likely been hidden for a reason. He flipped through more letters, the words feeling intimate and raw. It wasn't just the fact that Samuel, a black man, had been involved in a secret relationship with a white woman during a time when such relationships were not only taboo but outright dangerous. It was the tenderness between them, the way they wrote to each other, that struck Jamal. It reminded him of how love could bloom in the unlikeliest of places, even in the face of adversity and social constraints. But it also left him wondering how this secret had shaped the generations that followed, how it might have twisted into the silence that hung heavy in this house. Suddenly, the soft creak of the basement door interrupted his thoughts. Jamal quickly placed the letters back into the chest and closed it just as Mrs. Whittaker's footsteps echoed on the stairs. "Everything okay down here?" she asked, her voice cutting through the stillness. Jamal's heart raced for a brief moment as he turned to face her, trying to keep his expression neutral. "Yeah, just assessing the pipes," he replied, his voice steady. He wiped his hands on a rag to buy a little time, his mind still reeling from what he'd just uncovered. Mrs. Whittaker hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes scanning the room with a subtle unease, as if she could sense that something was off. Jamal wondered if she knew about the chest, or if its contents had been forgotten over time. Perhaps it was an inherited relic, something left to collect dust, without anyone understanding its significance. "I hope it's nothing too serious," she said, offering a tight smile. "My husband isn't a fan of disruptions." Jamal nodded. "I should have everything fixed soon. Just a small leak. Won't take long." Mrs. Whittaker lingered for a moment longer, her eyes lingering on him as if she wanted to say something more. But then, without another word, she turned and went back upstairs, the door clicking shut behind her. The tension in the room seemed to intensify as soon as she was gone. Jamal exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment. He looked back at the chest. He wasn't sure what he should do. There was a part of him that wanted to close it and walk away. This was a family matter, something he had no right to meddle in. But another part of him felt a strange obligation to understand more. It wasn't every day that you stumbled upon such a deep and hidden story. This wasn't just a personal secret, it was a part of the larger, complicated history of race and love in this country. And it was sitting right here, in this basement, forgotten and buried. After another moment of hesitation, Jamal opened the chest again and gently sifted through the letters. The dates were from the 1940s, during a time when interracial relationships were heavily stigmatized, and in some places, outright illegal. The letters chronicled secret meetings, stolen moments, and plans for a future that, based on the tone of the later letters, seemed more and more uncertain as time went on. It was as if the weight of society's judgment had finally worn them down. The last few letters had an air of resignation, as though both Samuel and the woman, whom Jamal now guessed to be an ancestor of the Whittakers, had come to terms with the fact that their love was doomed to remain hidden, unacknowledged, forever confined to these written pages. Jamal could almost picture it, Samuel, dressed in his servant's uniform, driving for the family, perhaps catching glimpses of the woman he loved from the rearview mirror. She, a young woman bound by the expectations of her family and society, struggling to reconcile her feelings with the reality of her world. They were two people trapped by circumstance, their lives dictated by the invisible, but very real barriers of race and class. The love between them had been real, but the world around them hadn't allowed it to flourish openly. Jamal's thoughts wandered to his own experiences, the subtle and not-so-subtle ways race had shaped his life. The stares, the assumptions, the quiet judgments. Even in his work as a plumber, he could tell when clients were uncomfortable with him. Sometimes it was the way they avoided eye contact, or how they hovered nearby, watching him more closely than they would someone else. It was unspoken, but ever present. He wondered if that same dynamic had played out between Samuel and the Whittakers. Had Samuel been treated with respect, or was he seen as just another black man serving a wealthy white family? And what had happened to him after the letters stopped? The last one in the chest was dated from 1948. Did he leave? Was he forced out? Or had something worse happened? The possibilities weighed on Jamal as he closed the chest once more, his mind swirling with questions. Whatever had happened, it was clear that the Whittakers had buried this part of their family's history deep, hoping it would stay hidden. But now, by some strange twist of fate, Jamal had uncovered it. He finished fixing the pipes quickly, his movements efficient and precise. As he packed up his tools, he couldn't stop thinking about what he'd found. Part of him wanted to confront Mrs. Whittaker, to ask if she knew about the letters, about Samuel and the woman who had loved him. But he knew that wasn't his place. He was just the plumber, here to fix a leak. Still, as he climbed the stairs and emerged back into the pristine, carefully controlled world of the Whittaker house, the secret weighed on him. Mrs. Whittaker met him at the door, her expression unchanged. "All done?" she asked, her voice as polite as ever. "All done," Jamal replied. "Just a small fix, but it should hold." "Thank you," she said, reaching for her wallet. As she handed him the payment, her fingers brushed his for the briefest of moments, and for that instant, Jamal wondered if she could sense the knowledge he now carried. But her face betrayed nothing, and she quickly withdrew her hand. "Have a good day," she said, her tone signaling that the conversation was over. Jamal nodded, offering a simple, "You too," before turning and walking back to his van. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had uncovered something far more significant than a family's forgotten love story. It was a reminder of how the past, no matter how deeply buried, always had a way of resurfacing. The drive back from the Whittaker house should have felt like any other routine job completed. Jamal should have been glad to have another client satisfied, another payment in his pocket, but instead, the discovery in the basement weighed heavily on him. The sun had dipped lower in the sky as he drove through the winding suburban streets, the image of the old photographs and letters replaying in his mind like a movie on repeat. The faces of the people in those photos, the intimacy of their words, they felt alive, more real than anything in that grand house. Jamal couldn't help but think about the lives behind those letters, especially Samuel. What had become of him? Did anyone in the Whittaker family even know who he was, or had they deliberately erased him from their history? The thought made Jamal uncomfortable. He imagined the layers of privilege and silence that had built up over the years, pushing Samuel's story deeper and deeper until it was nothing more than a forgotten secret in a dusty old chest. It gnawed at him, the injustice of it. Jamal's job was straightforward, fix what was broken and move on, but this was different. This felt like an emotional leak, one that had gone unnoticed, seeping through generations. And now, somehow, he had stumbled across it. When Jamal finally pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, he sat in the quiet of his van for a moment, trying to shake off the unease. His own small, modest home was a world away from the sprawling Whittaker mansion, but it felt more real, more honest. Everything in his life had been earned through hard work and perseverance, and he had never taken any of it for granted. As he stepped inside, the warmth of the house greeted him, but the sense of unrest lingered. He dropped his toolbox near the front door and headed straight for the kitchen. The clatter of his keys on the counter seemed unusually loud in the stillness of the evening. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, staring out the window, lost in thought. The quiet of the house wasn't comforting tonight. It felt like the secrets he had uncovered were following him, echoing through the silence. The next morning, as Jamal gathered his gear for another day of work, he found himself still thinking about the Whittaker family. He knew it wasn't his place, but the urge to learn more about Samuel and the woman he loved gnawed at him. He considered going back, making an excuse to check on the pipes, just to see if he could find any more clues. But that would be pushing his boundaries, and Jamal wasn't the kind of man to overstep. He respected the privacy of his clients, even if what he had discovered made it hard to turn a blind eye. He tried to push the thoughts to the back of his mind as he focused on the day's work, but they always crept back in. Every so often, his mind would drift to the Whittakers' perfectly manicured lawn, their pristine home, and that chest sitting quietly in the basement, waiting for someone to uncover its truth again. That evening, after another long day of work, Jamal received an unexpected call. The screen lit up with an unknown number, but something in his gut told him to answer. "Hello," he said cautiously. "Jamal? This is Mrs. Whittaker." He wasn't expecting to hear from her again, and the sound of her voice instantly brought him back to that basement, to the quiet tension that had hung in the air during his visit. "Yes, Mrs. Whittaker. How can I help you?" he asked, keeping his tone professional, though the unease in his chest tightened. "I wanted to thank you again for fixing the leak," she began, but her voice was softer now, less formal than it had been before. I wanted to ask if you found anything unusual while you were down there." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected this might come up, but he wasn't prepared for the directness of the question. He could hear the hesitation in her voice, the weight of whatever she was carrying. She knew something, or at the very least, suspected that he had stumbled across something. He took a breath, trying to find the right words. "No, ma'am. I didn't come across anything out of the ordinary," he said carefully. It wasn't a lie, what he had found wasn't ordinary, but he hadn't been snooping around either. He was there to fix the pipes, and that was the truth. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Jamal could hear Mrs. Whittaker's breath catch slightly before she continued. "I see. Well, I appreciate your work. I just thought I'd check. My husband is very particular about our things." Jamal sensed that this wasn't really about her husband's particularity. It was about the past, about the weight of what had been hidden in that chest for so long. He could feel the tension in her voice, the quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that she knew, or at least had some idea, of what was down there. "I understand," Jamal replied, keeping his tone respectful. "If there's anything else you need, just let me know." After a few more pleasantries, the call ended, but the unease stayed with him. Something about the conversation felt incomplete, like there was more Mrs. Whittaker wanted to say, but couldn't. He wondered if she had known all along, or if this was something she had only recently discovered. Either way, it was clear that the secret in the basement had touched a nerve, and Jamal's discovery had brought it closer to the surface. A few days passed, and Jamal tried to put the Whittakers out of his mind. He kept busy with work, focusing on other clients and other jobs. But the feeling that something was left unfinished haunted him. He knew that what he had uncovered was bigger than just an old love affair. It was about how families like the Whittakers built their lives on secrets, how those secrets, buried deep beneath the surface, could shape generations. One afternoon, while working on a job in a nearby neighborhood, Jamal's phone buzzed again. It was another unknown number, but this time, when he answered, the voice on the other end was not Mrs. Whittaker. It was Mr. Whittaker. "Mr. Jamal, this is Charles Whittaker." The voice was cold, direct, and lacking the polite veneer that his wife had used. "I'm calling about the work you did for us last week." Jamal's pulse quickened. He knew where this conversation was headed. "Yes, Mr. Whittaker. How can I help you?" he replied, keeping his tone steady, even as his mind raced. "Did you find anything unusual while you were in our basement?" Charles Whittaker's voice had a slight edge to it, as though he was searching for something specific in Jamal's response. Jamal hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. He could feel the tension in Mr. Whittaker's words, the way they were carefully chosen. It was clear that this wasn't just about the plumbing. "I was focused on the leak, sir," Jamal replied, choosing his words carefully. "I didn't have much time to look around at anything else." Another pause, and then Mr. Whittaker's voice dropped lower, colder. "I see. Just so we're clear, I don't want any rumors or misunderstandings. We value our privacy, and I trust you understand that." Jamal clenched the phone a little tighter, understanding the unspoken warning in Mr. Whittaker's words. This was a man used to control, and he didn't like the idea of someone, even a hired professional, digging too deep into his family's past. "I understand, Mr. Whittaker," Jamal said evenly. "I'm just here to do my job." "Good. Let's keep it that way," Mr. Whittaker replied before abruptly ending the call. Jamal stood there, phone in hand, feeling the full weight of the unease settle over him. The Whittakers knew. Maybe not everything, but they knew enough to be afraid. What they feared, though, was not just the discovery of a forgotten love story. It was the exposure of a hidden part of their legacy, a part they'd rather keep buried beneath the surface, out of sight. As Jamal put his phone away, he realized that no matter how carefully the past was hidden, it had a way of resurfacing. The Whittakers could try to control it, but the truth had a way of leaking out, just like the pipes he had come to fix. And Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't over yet. The next few days passed in a haze of tension for Jamal. He busied himself with other clients and other jobs, but the weight of the Whittaker family's hidden secret continued to gnaw at him. The strange phone calls from both Mr. and Mrs. Whittaker had put him on edge. Something was building beneath the surface, and Jamal felt like he was standing at the center of it all, unsure of what would come next. He had thought about the old chest every day since he found it. The photographs, the letters, the story they told, they wouldn't leave his mind. And now, with Mr. Whittaker's veiled warning still ringing in his ears, Jamal knew the family wasn't just protecting their privacy. They were guarding something much deeper, something they feared could unravel everything they'd built. But despite the warnings, despite the uncomfortable conversations, Jamal couldn't help but feel drawn to the mystery. It wasn't just idle curiosity. There was something about the story of Samuel and the woman he loved that resonated with Jamal on a deeply personal level. He knew what it was like to navigate a world that placed barriers between people based on race. He understood the weight of history, how the past could shape the present in ways both subtle and overt. The letters in that chest were proof of a forgotten connection, one that had likely been erased from the Whittaker family's narrative. That evening, after another long day of work, Jamal found himself sitting at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. He hadn't planned on it, but his fingers moved instinctively to search the Whittaker family name online. He scrolled through articles about the family's influence in the community, their charity work, their spotless reputation. It was all surface-level stuff, the kind of thing that painted a picture of perfection, a family untouched by scandal or controversy. But then, something caught his eye, a mention of Mrs. Whittaker's grandmother in an old Society article from the 1940s. Her name was Evelyn Whittaker, and the brief paragraph mentioned her engagement to a prominent businessman. Jamal recognized the name immediately, EW, the initials from the letters in the chest. She was the woman who had written to Samuel. The engagement must have been arranged by her family, a path set out for her that didn't include the man she truly loved. Jamal's mind raced as he pieced together the story. Evelyn had likely been forced to give up Samuel, to follow the life her family had planned for her. The letters had ended, but what had become of Samuel? Had he left the family? Had he been dismissed when the relationship was discovered? Or worse, had something more sinister happened to him? The questions swirled in Jamal's mind as he sat there, trying to make sense of it all. He knew one thing for certain: the Whittakers had buried this part of their history, and they had no intention of letting it resurface. The following week, as Jamal continued his routine jobs, the tension built. He expected another phone call from the Whittakers at any moment, half wondering if they would accuse him outright of finding their secret. But the call never came. Instead, one afternoon, after finishing a job nearby, Jamal decided to drive past the Whittaker house again. He didn't have a clear plan in mind, but something compelled him to return, even if only to see the place that had so captivated his thoughts. As he pulled into the familiar driveway, his stomach tightened. The house looked the same, pristine, polished, the picture of suburban perfection. But Jamal knew now that appearances were deceiving. He parked his van and sat there for a few minutes, unsure of what he was doing. He told himself he was just checking on the pipes, but he knew it went deeper than that. Finally, he stepped out and walked up to the front door, ringing the bell. It was Mrs. Whittaker who answered, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of him. "Jamal," she said, her voice tight. "I wasn't expecting you. Is something wrong?" "I just wanted to check on the pipes, ma'am," Jamal replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Make sure everything's still in good shape after the repair." Mrs. Whittaker hesitated for a moment, glancing behind her as if to see if anyone else was watching. Finally, she stepped aside, letting Jamal in. The air in the house felt even heavier than before, as though the walls themselves were keeping secrets. As they walked through the familiar rooms toward the basement, Jamal noticed how Mrs. Whittaker's posture had changed. She was no longer the perfectly composed woman he had first met. There was something in her demeanor now, a tension that made her movements seem more guarded, more anxious. When they reached the basement door, she paused. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. "I thought the problem was fixed." "It is," Jamal said, choosing his words carefully. "But I wanted to double-check. Sometimes small leaks can turn into bigger problems if they're not addressed." She stared at him for a moment longer, before nodding and opening the door. Jamal descended the stairs, feeling the cool air of the basement wash over him. The chest was still in the corner, untouched, but it seemed to loom larger now, as though it was waiting for something, or someone. Jamal knelt by the pipes, pretending to inspect them, but his mind was elsewhere. Mrs. Whittaker remained at the top of the stairs, her presence lingering in the doorway like a shadow. Jamal could feel her watching him, her unspoken question hanging in the air. "Did you find anything unusual last time you were down here?" she asked again, her voice softer now, almost pleading. Jamal stood up slowly, turning to face her. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she was grappling with something deeper than just a plumber checking her pipes. "I found some old photos," Jamal admitted, deciding that the time for half-truths had passed. "And some letters." Mrs. Whittaker's face paled, and for a moment, Jamal thought she might collapse under the weight of his words. She clutched the doorframe for support, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. You weren't supposed to see those," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No one was." Jamal didn't move. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them, the years of secrecy unraveling in a single exchange. "I wasn't trying to pry," Jamal said gently. "But what I found, it matters. It's part of your family's history." Mrs. Whittaker shook her head, her eyes filling with something between fear and desperation. "That part of our history is gone. It's buried. My grandmother, she made sure of that." Jamal could hear the pain in her voice, the way she spoke of Evelyn as if the woman had carried a burden that had been passed down through the generations. It wasn't just about love, it was about the shame, the fear, the impossible choices forced upon people because of race and social standing. "Your grandmother loved him," Jamal said softly, taking a step closer. "Samuel. She loved him enough to keep those letters all these years." Mrs. Whittaker's shoulders sagged, and she sank onto the top step of the basement stairs, her hands trembling in her lap. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I always knew. But my family, they didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to pretend it never happened." Jamal knelt down beside her, his voice calm, understanding. "But it did happen. And it's not something that should be hidden forever." For a long moment, Mrs. Whittaker sat in silence, staring at the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I don't know what to do. My husband, he doesn't understand. He thinks it's all just old history, that it doesn't matter." "But it does, doesn't it?" Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "It does. The past is part of who we are. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away." Mrs. Whittaker looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered. "For not walking away." Jamal stood, offering her a hand as she rose to her feet. "Some things aren't meant to stay buried forever," he said quietly. And as they stood there in the dim light of the basement, surrounded by the echoes of a long-forgotten love, both of them knew that the truth had finally begun to surface. As Jamal left the Whittaker house that day, he felt a strange sense of closure, as though the weight of the secret he had uncovered had been lifted, if only slightly. The story wasn't over, but at least now, it had a chance to be told. The days after the confrontation in the Whittaker basement were quieter, though the weight of what had transpired lingered in Jamal's mind. He hadn't expected things to unfold the way they did. The last thing he had imagined was sitting with Mrs. Whittaker, the woman of the pristine house, both of them bound by a secret they could no longer deny. But now that the truth was out, the question remained, what would happen next? Would Mrs. Whittaker tell her family? Would they finally confront the hidden parts of their past, or would this simply fade back into the shadows? Jamal didn't have the answers, but something in Mrs. Whittaker's eyes told him that a change was inevitable. A week later, as Jamal was finishing up another job, his phone buzzed. The name on the screen was familiar now, Mrs. Whittaker. Jamal paused before answering, feeling the tension in his chest build. Their last conversation had been emotionally heavy, and part of him wasn't sure if he was ready to dive back into that. "Hello," he answered. "Jamal?" Mrs. Whittaker's voice was softer than he remembered, as if the weeks had chipped away at the tight, composed woman she had been. I wanted to thank you again. For helping me. For not turning away when you saw those letters. You don't need to thank me, Jamal replied. It was the right thing to do. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, followed by a deep breath. I've been thinking a lot since you left, she continued. About my family, about the secrets we've kept for so long. And I've talked to my husband about it. At first, he didn't want to hear it, but after some time. I think he understands. At least, a little. Jamal nodded, though Mrs. Whittaker couldn't see it. That's good to hear. It's never easy to face something like that, but it's important. I've been going through more of my grandmother's things, she said, her voice wavering slightly. And I found more letters. Not just from Samuel, but from other people. People who worked for the family, people who weren't part of the official history. It made me realize just how much of our story has been shaped by those we tried to erase. Jamal felt a pang in his chest. This was bigger than just a secret love affair. This was about how entire lives, entire communities, could be written out of history, forgotten because they didn't fit the narrative of privilege and power. Samuel wasn't the only one whose story had been buried. I'm glad you're looking into it, Jamal said quietly. It's important that those stories are told. Mrs. Whittaker hesitated, and when she spoke again, her voice was filled with a quiet determination. I've decided to tell my children. They're still young, but they deserve to know where they come from. The truth, not just the version we've presented to the world. Jamal was taken aback for a moment. He hadn't expected her to go that far, to open up the full history of her family to the next generation. But as the realization sunk in, he felt a deep sense of respect for her decision. That's a brave choice, he said. It's the only choice, she replied, a touch of strength returning to her voice. I don't want them to grow up thinking that their family is perfect, or that they're somehow separate from the history of this country. I want them to understand that we are all connected, in ways both beautiful and painful. Jamal felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. This was what he had hoped for, what he hadn't even dared to imagine would happen. The past, once buried, was finally being brought into the light. I'm glad to hear that, Mrs. Whittaker. Truly, Jamal said. She let out a small, relieved laugh. I should call you by your first name, shouldn't I? After all this, I feel like I've known you much longer than just a few weeks. Jamal is fine, he replied, smiling. There was another brief pause, and then Mrs. Whittaker spoke again, this time more seriously. I'm going to look into Samuel's life. I want to know what happened to him. I've asked my husband to help me, and we're going to start researching, maybe even reach out to some historical societies. I can't undo what happened to him, but I can make sure his story isn't forgotten. Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected this level of commitment, but it made sense. Mrs. Whittaker had been confronted with the reality of her family's history, and now she was choosing to do something about it. That's really good of you, Jamal said, his voice thick with emotion. Samuel deserves that. And I want to thank you again, she added, her voice filled with sincerity. If you hadn't found those letters, if you hadn't brought this to my attention, I don't think any of this would have happened. I would have gone on living in ignorance, thinking that my family was somehow untouched by the struggles of the world. Jamal felt humbled by her words. I just did what felt right, he said quietly. I'm glad I could help. After they hung up, Jamal sat in silence for a while, reflecting on everything that had happened. The weight of the secret he had uncovered was no longer just his to carry. Mrs. Whittaker had taken it upon herself to confront her family's history, to reckon with the uncomfortable truths they had tried to bury. Weeks passed, and Jamal received updates from time to time. Mrs. Whittaker had started sharing more of her findings with local historians, and they had begun piecing together Samuel's life. It turned out that he had left the Whittaker family shortly after Evelyn's engagement was announced, moving north to start a new life. He had worked as a chauffeur for other families, but he never married. His love for Evelyn, it seemed, had stayed with him until the end. For Jamal, this knowledge brought a bittersweet sense of closure. Samuel's story hadn't ended the way it should have, but at least now, it was being told. He wasn't just a footnote in the Whittaker family's history anymore. He was a part of it, his life intertwined with theirs in ways they could no longer ignore. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the city, Jamal sat on his porch, sipping a cold drink and reflecting on everything that had transpired. He thought about how easily history could be forgotten, how stories could be erased simply because they didn't fit the narrative people wanted to believe. But now, thanks to a small leak in an old basement, a forgotten love story had been brought back into the light. And Jamal knew that, in some small way, he had helped make that happen. The past had resurfaced, and with it, the possibility of healing, not just for the Whittaker family, but for anyone who had ever felt erased or forgotten. Samuel's story wasn't buried anymore, and neither was the truth. As Jamal watched the sunset, a sense of peace settled over him. He knew that the story wasn't over, it never truly was, but for now, it felt like the beginning of something new, something better. And that, he thought, was more than enough. That's it for today. If you learned something new, please like and share this video. We'll see you in the next one.